He glanced over at Theon and quickly looked away, abashed. "I spied a turkey," Theon said, annoyed by the question. "How was I to know that you'd leave the boy alone?" A Game of Thrones brand chapter 5 when the wildlings nearly capture him in the woods. Hi there, everyone. It was just Thanksgiving in the United States, so while I was working on my last Game of Thrones videos yesterday, I started thinking about foods in Westeros. Do animals and plants traditionally eaten on Thanksgiving in America exist in Westeros? And deeper than that, should they exist there? Well, actually, it's not just off the top of my head. I've been intermittently working on a video series about culture and world building in Westeros for the past year or so. Obviously put on hold due to covering Season 8 and its aftermath. But one of the full hour-long documentary videos I hope to make eventually for that is New World crops in Westeros. So, given that it's right after Thanksgiving, I wanted to dash off this quick preview video of sorts based on my current notes for the full documentary. So this is shorter, it's a rough draft, it's just focused on Thanksgiving foods, and I'm not going to put that much work into putting better pictures in it. This is mostly just showing the quotes that I found. But, the full version, which will be like January, February, months from now when I get through all the prequel stuff, that'll be higher quality than this. Because in my video series, I've been trying to explore world building in how medieval Europe was different from modern day culture, both physically and mentally, mental constructs, and then comparing how the medieval Europe-inspired fantasy world Westeros is set in is depicted. It's annoying when you get lazy fantasy writers who basically just create people in medieval costumes who talk and act like modern people, and it gets even more annoying when they make anachronistic references to things that didn't physically exist yet. Like, they didn't have clocks, like wristwatches, or skipping around here, like when Gendry proposes to Arya in Season 8 and he gets down on one knee and personally asks her, that's how modern people do that. In the real Middle Ages, he would ask the head of her household and he wouldn't get down on a knee. That was modern. So, but not just this series, other series where they just forget that thing or food wouldn't exist in the real Middle Ages. It's a fantasy world, it's not necessarily the exact real world, but you're trying to do something based on that. Other things, like medieval Europe didn't conceptually have a separation of public and private power, or an abstract concept of government. So another stupid thing the TV show did was there's a point where they have Stannis say, "Oh, if the wildlings will fight for me, I will make them citizens of the realm," and it's not once in the books do they ever use the word citizen. They use subjects. Citizen is a specific legal concept. Or this abstract concept of the nation state. That these aren't terms they use, or you have them talking like modern people. And I know it seems small, but when we let the little things go in earlier seasons, we just laughed off, or like Season 2, oh, I guess Benioff and Weiss are a little rough around the edges. And that lays the groundwork to accept bigger and bigger errors until it's, come on, kid, the plot doesn't need to make sense in Season 8, just forget everything. That these are the standards we should be holding this stuff. Star Wars. Star Wars has this level of scrutiny of, that wouldn't exist yet, that's a real-life term, they don't talk like that, of that level of world building. And this is what you deserve, the level of detail that we should be striving for instead of settling for random incoherence. So, other things, though, like their government or their concept of gender roles and sexuality was different from ours. I've talked about that. Or of religion and philosophy, that it's not that they were conservative compared to us. It's they didn't have our paradigm, that their entire worldview is different, that they didn't have our concept of government, that kind of thing. But it's more interesting when you get into things that are like concepts, like gender or government. But when you get to like physical things of, well, they didn't have the printing press. How did they write and learn to write? And how were things built, materials? Westeros doesn't have the printing press either, so that's okay. But just how did stuff physically work in the Middle Ages? And usually Westeros is a pretty realistic setting. For things such as, a big one is the economy. I've already made a big video on how does their economy realistically function, because, for example, they use the gold standard, that everything is backed up by gold. The currency is made of precious metals, which is different from ours, that we went off the gold standard. We're on an abstract value system, so they function differently, and you can see how they work with inflation cycles, that sort of thing. So, this specific, and this is just a rough draft. I am racing it off because it was just Thanksgiving, okay, for fun. So, what I want to focus on here is the question of New World animals and plants. That is, species from the American continents, North and South, that physically were not present in medieval Europe prior to around the year 1500. That's how I'm defining that. 1500 is, when you see a textbook, that's roughly when historians mark the end of the late Middle Ages and beginning of the early modern era. Columbus's first voyage to America was 1492. Protestant Reformation started in 1517. 1500 is a nice round figure. When Europeans began exploring and settling North and South America, it led to a massive intercontinental exchange of various plant and animal species which had evolved separately on the different sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Collectively, both Americas were the New World, while the Old World was Europe, and the other connected landmasses of Asia and Africa, which could plausibly trade with Europe. And Australia's off there in the Southern Ocean, doing its own thing, teeming with kangaroos and thylacines and monotremes waiting to be discovered, but they didn't know about that either. So it's Europe and stuff they could plausibly get through trade from the Islamic world or the East Asian world like China, versus these are plants and animals from North America that could never have been in Europe before 1500. So let's start with plants. Just quick summary, if you're Googling this online, the Columbian Exchange is what it's called. Starting with plants, New World crops that did not exist in medieval Europe before contact with the Americas include maize corn on the cob, tomatoes, potatoes, bell peppers and chili peppers, pumpkins and squash, avocados, peanuts, pecan nuts, pineapples, tobacco, vanilla, and cocoa beans, from which chocolate is made. They didn't have chocolate in the Middle Ages. That was something the Aztecs and Maya drank. And after contact, these crops were exported back to Europe, and in many cases turned into a big part of various economies. I mean, look at how much Ireland in a couple of hundred years became dependent on potatoes. It was actually an export crop. They weren't just eating them. When the potato famine happened, it was because their economy collapsed. They usually sold the potatoes to other parts of Europe. Just how much this changed everything. Meanwhile, there were some Old World crops that medieval Europe already had access to, which were exported to the Americas that they didn't have. Wheat, rice, cotton, apples, onions, bananas, and various citrus fruits, all the major citrus fruits. As for animals, this is a little different, that you see this massive, a lot of it was all to Europe with all these major crops like tomatoes that we think of as, big part of cuisine there that they didn't have yet. Animals, on the other hand, in terms of domesticated livestock raised for food, transfer was pretty much one way from Europe to the Americas. The Native Americans hadn't domesticated quite as many animal species yet. Also, there were a lot of animals that didn't physically exist, like they didn't have wild horses. So horses just dramatically changed the whole landscape when they were imported from Europe. Other livestock, food livestock, you got cattle, pigs, sheep, chicken, goats, also other animals like cats and dogs, domesticated. They didn't have yet. And, those can wreak havoc in a local ecosystem if you let them loose. How many localized ecosystems in the Americas or tropical islands were just devastated by uh, domestic cats went feral, or domestic dogs eating all the eggs. So that had a big impact as well. In contrast, New World food animals that didn't exist in Europe were largely limited to llamas and alpacas, which are cousin species, they're related, and also the wild turkey. Other species from the Americas which were not domesticated include things like opossums or raccoons. They didn't have raccoons in Europe. I mean, some of these have been exported since, but originally raccoons are from North America. Also skunks. So if you're like reading some old Germanic fairy tale, Brothers Grimm and the Schwarzwald from like the year 1200, a knight isn't going to meet a friendly raccoon. There weren't raccoons in Germany in the 1200s. That's a North American animal. So an issue with some fantasy literature, medieval fantasy literature, is that it's supposedly loosely set in a world inspired by medieval Europe, when medieval Europe didn't actually have a lot of these foods. Big example is J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings series, that Tolkien was painfully aware, and he wrote essays on this, that some of these things shouldn't exist yet. Well, it's more that he was a master linguist, so he approached it from a linguistic perspective, that to him, he obsessed over this, that certain food names didn't sound right in that context to him, that it's potato, tomato, these are Native American words. And it sounded anachronistic to him, to his trained ear, that this isn't how these people would talk. It's such a foreign word to them. And in one case, Tolkien infamously went so far as to remove mention of tomatoes from the first draft of The Hobbit. The first edition of The Hobbit mentions tomatoes, and the second edition and all subsequent editions changed that one-off line. He said there aren't tomatoes there. And on top of this, the problem is the Shire itself is anachronistic. I mean, it's based on his idealized childhood in the Midlands of England, right before it got really industrialized with the First World War. So, this merry old England thing. So there's a few anachronistic bits and pieces, like they have umbrellas. He mentions clocks, even though they really shouldn't have clocks, and later retcon that out. But, a big thing is it's his childhood. You think, by that point, 400 or 500 years after the contact with the Americas, like potatoes had become a staple crop. So, childhood foods that were really good to him were like things that were using potatoes, which, on the one hand, it's his childhood is the Shire versus, well, I realize it wouldn't really be there. So he put in a couple of anachronistic things that he didn't take out. He took out tomatoes, but other things he left in grudgingly because he really wanted them to be in there, like potatoes and tobacco. That hobbits are described as eating potatoes and smoking tobacco. So it's at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. I hope you've all read this, but if you remember, at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, he has this whole essay in the foreword concerning pipeweed, explaining in advance why are there these anachronistic crops there, because it bothered him. So his answer was to come up with different names for them. That tobacco is pervasively called pipeweed. He made a different term for that it doesn't using a Native American word. And potatoes are usually referred to as taters. And he even came up with these elaborate explanations. Well, how did they get there? It's not just the name, it's why are they even there? And he said, well, the Númenóreans are the ancestors of the Gondorians. Aragorn's ancestors, the Númenóreans, the island nation that's fallen into the sea. It's like Atlantis. And they were these great sea explorers. So his explanation he gave is that, well, the ancient Numenorian sea explorers must have brought tobacco and potatoes back to Middle-earth from their explorations from some other unknown continent, which no one remembers now, but it isn't native to here. We must have brought it from somewhere else. So with a wink and a grin, he acknowledged, like, it must not be from there. So, with all this setup, how does this play out in George R. R. Martin's fantasy world where Westeros is set? Westeros, the whole world doesn't have one name, Planetos, that's a fan name. Westeros, Essos, everything we know of. How does this handle it? Now, for a couple of years, I thought Martin was just sticking to animals and plants that existed in real-life medieval Europe, barring the exceptional fantastical animals like dire wolves and woolly mammoths, to say nothing of dragons. And while I did know of that one quote I gave at the beginning about Theon hunting a turkey, I assumed it was a one-off error for a couple of years, and I was wrong. You see, there came one day over Twitter where I was chatting with the author of the officially licensed tie-in cookbook for the series, A Feast of Ice and Fire. So I'm chatting with the author of A Feast of Ice and Fire, Chelsea, and I brought this up, and she pointed out to me, she corrected me, well, no, there's repeated mention of the Dornish eating chili peppers, a New World crop. This isn't a one-off mistake. That Martin didn't just put in turkey when he meant chicken. And the problem is, whenever I read about Dornish hot peppers, that's a phrase they keep using, Dornish hot peppers in the books, I sort of just mentally glossed over it, thinking they were referring to pepper spices, like black pepper, the spices you put on food. But no, Chelsea pointed out to me, she said, oh no, there's multiple quotes where Dornish characters are clearly eating stuffed peppers. So they can't be the spice, like black peppercorn. And for example here, A Feast for Crows, one of the Ariane Martell chapters, quote, if she desired some favorite food, they had figs or olives or peppers stuffed with cheese. And there's repeated mention at these hot peppers stuffed with cheese. Basically, a popular snack in Dorne is hot jalapeno poppers stuffed with cheese. I mean, they don't call them jalapenos, but they call them hot peppers, but that's what it is. So if you have like a fan-made cookbook, like A Feast of Ice and Fire, you can make jalapeno hot peppers and say, look at these wonderful Dornish these Dornish hot peppers when you're having like a viewing party or something. So she corrected me and abashed at this, that, she was right. I went back and checked the books using an e-search tool just for food names. And there's actually quite a few plants and animals in Westeros that didn't exist in real Middle Ages Europe. So I'm going to work on a longer version of this later that has, like better slides in it. It goes into more detail about things that aren't just food, but, plants and animals in general. Right now I'm focusing on, Thanksgiving foods. Traditional Thanksgiving foods in America. It'll be weird seeing comments from people who don't live in America from Europe and stuff. At the beginning of this, I already mentioned that one reference to a turkey. It's only one reference seen in the North. It turns out, though, that they also have maize corn. At Thanksgiving, you have turkey, corn. Now, I say specifically maize corn to specify the New World crop grown on the cob. You see, this complicates things. The word corn by itself, in an archaic sense, just refers to grain in general. It's a synonym. Corn, grain. Like, even in Lord of the Rings, you'd see references to corn mills. Well, even in the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, Martin will have characters mentioning corn when it's clear they're talking about wheat. Or a lot of times in the books, complicating this is ravens will beg for corn. They can call like a parrot. They can say simple words. They'll go, corn, corn. And they could just mean any kind of grain. They don't mean maize corn. But I went and checked more closely than that, than just a word search. I started reading them in context, and Yeah, there are points in the books where unambiguously characters are eating what is explicitly described as maize corn. A Clash of Kings, Arya Chapter 3. Outside a holdfast called Briarwhite, some field hands surrounded them in a cornfield, demanding coin for the ears they'd taken. Then later on in the same chapter, they roasted the sweet corn in the husk that night, turning the ears with long forked sticks, and ate it right off the cob. Arya thought it tasted wonderful. So here we've got Arya in the second book eating what's clearly described as corn on the cob, maize corn, which did not exist in England during the Middle Ages. Like how Martin has said that the A Song of Ice and Fire series is loosely based on the English War of the Roses in the 1400s. This is pre-American contact. Apparently, just from these brief references, apparently their in-universe term for maize corn is sweet corn. That's what Westeros calls it. It's popped up in a few other chapters. So apparently maize corn is a relatively common crop from at least the Riverlands through the Reach, from how it's been described. Here we have another one, A Clash of Kings, same book, Catelyn 2, when she's meeting at Renly's army camp. The war had not touched the fabled bounty of Highgarden. There were great loaves of brown bread, mounds of turnips, and sweet corn. Third novel, this was across a couple of books, Storm of Swords, Tyrion Chapter 8. Tyrion sampled sweet corn fritters and gnawed on a rib of wild boar. This is the purple wedding chapter. So at Joffrey's big wedding to Marjorie Tyrell, the book describes Tyrion as basically eating corn fritters. Maize corn fritters. Moving on top of that, there are many more references throughout the first three novels, 1 through 3, to pumpkins and squash in a world inspired by medieval Europe. Let's see here. A Game of Thrones, Arya Chapter 2. Her father had been fighting with the council again. Arya could see it on his face when he came to table, late again, as he had been so often. The first course, a thick, sweet soup made with pumpkins, had already been taken away when Ned Stark strode into the small hall. A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 6. In the Vale of Arryn, wheat and corn and barley grew high in its fields, and even in Highgarden, the pumpkins were no larger nor the fruit any sweeter than here. Then in A Clash of Kings, Bran Chapter 3, when they have the Harvest Festival, because it's autumn now, beans and squash and huge red onions. At a different point in A Clash of Kings, Tyrion 2, there's some spiced squash. So they have pumpkins and squash. Figuratively in the next one, Cersei bolted to her feet. And yet you sit there grinning like a harvest day pumpkin. Clash of Kings, Tyrion 6. And even through the third book, A Storm of Swords, this is Jaime 7, when food supplies start coming back from the Reach because the Tyrells have allied with them again. Food wagons from the Reach arrived, loaded with casks of cider, barrels of apples, bales of hay, and some of the biggest pumpkins Jaime had ever seen. So from the Reach to the Vale, and probably beyond, it turns out that pumpkins and squash are common crops in Westeros. So all of these Thanksgiving foods, turkeys, maize corn, pumpkins, squash, also pecan nuts, if you enjoy having a pecan pie for dessert on Thanksgiving, those are a New World crop as well. Potatoes were never mentioned in the books. I've checked for them or taters, but if you're worried about this, characters at different points have mentioned potatoes in the TV show, and at the time I really criticized them for it, like since season 2, if they never mentioned potatoes in the books. Probably absent-mindedly, but I'm going to pull my punches on this one because, if it turns out that, well, they do have maize corn and pumpkins in the books, is that much of a jump to say maybe they also have potatoes? So I won't begrudge the TV show for that just because they have bigger problems. So they might have potatoes, but they haven't mentioned it in 5 books. So the point of this is just when you're sitting down to eat Thanksgiving leftovers, I hope while you're eating through all this, you're thinking about like world building things. If wow, these are foods that wouldn't exist in medieval Europe, and what foods should or shouldn't exist in Westeros. Like obviously, a character won't suddenly start eating a modern Hershey's bar or drinking a modern coffee. Yeah. For those of you who are curious, coffee is an old world crop, but it's relatively modern that it only started out in Arabia in like the 1400s and spread to Europe by the 1600s. Coffee is a relatively modern thing, even in Arabia, and beyond that, in the first 5 novels, no one has been mentioned drinking coffee, even in the Eastern continent. So they could have coffee, but no one has mentioned it. Like, for all we know, Karth and Yeti really like coffee, but they haven't mentioned it. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch, but apparently even Martin thought, we can't have coffee in Westeros. It sounds too modern. It's a modern drink any more than like someone drinking a soda. Like it was an old world thing, but it's too modern. And none of this, though, really addresses the bigger question of why they have these anachronistic foods. That George R. R. Martin has made no mention of it or attempted to explain it, some sort of in-universe explanation, comparable to the way that J.R.R. Tolkien obsessed over little details about this in Lord of the Rings. The simple possibility is that these anachronistic foods might exist in Westeros just because. Tolkien stressed over this for Middle-earth, that because he made it a point that, well, Middle-earth is supposed to be our real world in a lost historical age thousands of years ago in the distant mythical past. So he did treat Middle-earth as, well, it is Europe in the age of legends. Martin, however, has repeatedly and explicitly said that Westeros is not our world in the past or the far future. It's just an alternate world with no connection to ours. So why do they have Thanksgiving foods like turkeys and pumpkins? Well, why do they have direwolves and mammoths when those didn't exist in medieval Europe either? Because it's fun. Personally, I think it's because Martin, the accusation that the books are filled with food porn, that it's because Martin really likes to put in descriptions of the foods he would want to eat, that he thinks sound delicious, and isn't going to let these niggling little historical details get in the way of a good meal. So this is just a rough cut of the video I've been rattling around in my head for a while. I'll make a bigger, better version later than this. But I'm the kind of guy who will buy the A Feast of Ice and Fire cookbook and try to make stuff from it. I made a video on that the other day. I'm going to make some more eventually. So when you're thinking of the world building, and in the future with the upcoming House of the Dragon prequel, like, what foods do these people eat that we shouldn't expect them to be like ordering a coffee and some Hot Pockets? They have to eat medieval foods.